What's up, guys? In this lesson, we're going to be talking about responsive design. Responsive design means that our content is usable on a range of different devices and viewports, and that the content may adapt based on the screen size of the user. The best way to illustrate responsive design is to take an example of a site that is not responsive. So we have such an example over on the right-hand side. We perhaps recognize our grid layout from earlier in the course. Let's slowly reduce the size of the viewport. So we can imagine our user is not on a PC with a big monitor. They are perhaps on a tablet or a phone. So they're going to be accessing our site on a narrower viewport. Now, as we get really narrow, we run into a couple of problems. The first problem is that grid layout no longer looks very good. It's fine when we have a wide viewport to have these two sections of the grid. It looks good, but on a narrow viewport, it actually looks too squashed. The other problem we have is to do with our nav bar. Notice how everything looks nice on a wider viewport with our nav, but as we get too narrow, there's simply not enough room for all of our nav links on the nav bar. All of a sudden, our nav bar looks really bad. And that's because this is not a responsive design. What should happen here is the styling should be slightly different for a page that has a narrow viewport. So is such a thing possible with CSS? The answer is yes. We need to make use of a feature of CSS known as media queries. Now, a media query is a type of @rule, and we can create a media query by typing @media. Then we need to set the parameters of this media query. So we do this in brackets. We're going to say max width colon followed by the desired width, which we'll set to 800 pixels in this case. In fact, let's make it 600 pixels. We can then use some curly brackets, and inside this block of code, we can create CSS rules as normal. These rules will apply to any media or view device like a tablet or a phone or a screen. It will apply to any media that has a viewport width of less than 600 pixels. So right above this, we have the styling for our grid container. And one of the things that we might look to do when the viewport gets narrow is reduce the number of columns available in that table. So instead of having our main content and our side text both on the same row, we'll actually have a one column table, and now that the side text will appear beneath the main content. So let's target grid container. We're going to change grid template columns, and we're simply going to have a single column, so we can put one FR there. And we can now rewrite our grid template areas. So we will have our header, which is just going to take up one row now, which is just going to take up one column now. It's going to be the top row. We'll then have main. A side will now be on a separate row. Then we'll have our footer. So let's save. Let's return to our page. In fact, with a quick refresh, we can already see that everything is appearing as a single column as part of this grid layout. So we'll increase the size of the viewport. At some point, we're going to reach 600 pixels. And at that point, we see we now have a two column table. So when the user is accessing this content on a large screen, you can see a grid with two columns. But when the user accesses this page on a mobile device, then he now sees everything in a single grid column. This is an example of responsive design. Now that's one of the two problems fixed. We need to fix the problem with our nav bar. Now, this is not really just a case of rearranging content. We actually need a different nav bar at a narrow viewport. And one common feature of nav bars on narrow viewports is the use of a hamburger menu. A hamburger menu is a button that has three horizontal lines. Hence, that's why it's called a hamburger. When the user clicks on it, it opens up a drop-down set of nav links. So as an example, we actually have a nav with a hamburger menu inside. Now this is actually pulled in externally. We have an external style sheet that defines that hamburger menu. It's inside this div. We don't really need to know too much other than this div is going to load up a hamburger menu icon. Now it's inside this nav class. Now it's inside this nav with a class of mobile viewport, but it's not loading up on the page at the moment. And if we scroll to the CSS styling of that element, we'll see the reason why. So the nav with the class of mobile viewport has a display of none. This is a really important CSS property and value when creating responsive web pages. Sometimes we'll want elements to either appear or not appear based on the width of the viewport. And at the moment, we've set display of none on the mobile viewport so that it just doesn't show up under any circumstances. Now, if we set display block, we'll see this element load on the page. You can see we actually have two nav bars at this stage. And rather than display block, if we set this to display flex, we actually have margin auto on that hamburger menu. So we're probably familiar with this type of icon. We can click on this and ordinarily it would open up a drop-down menu. And inside that drop-down menu are all of the nav links we would ordinarily have along the top if the viewport is full width. So home, shop, forum. You can see in this case that we've actually created two elements, two different navs. And the objective here is to load up one of those navs when the viewport is larger than 600 pixels and to load up the other when the viewport is less than 600 pixels. So let's set that display of flex back to display of none so that our hamburger menu disappears. Let's come down to our media query. We'll target the class of mobile viewport, which is the class we've assigned to that mobile nav. So remember, this is inside the media query block. So this will apply if the width of the viewport is less than 600 pixels. So we'll set display, flex. Okay, let's refresh our page. Let's reduce the size of the viewport. And you can see once we hit 600 pixels, that hamburger menu now appears. Now, of course, the whole idea here is not only should the hamburger menu appear, but the regular nav should disappear. So we can select that with the class wide viewport. And we know that if the viewport is not wide, i.e. it's less than 600 pixels, we now want display of none. Let's save that, refresh the page. So let's save that, refresh the page. Let's reduce the size of our viewport. You can see once we hit that 600 pixels mark, the nav bar changes to become a mobile-friendly nav bar. Now, this is just one example of a media query we could write. For example, if we wanted styling to apply specifically to viewports larger than 600 pixels, we could also have a min-width media query. And it's becoming increasingly common to make use of mobile-first responsive design. So we know that increasing proportions of website access are via mobile devices such as mobile phones. So it's becoming more and more important for web content to look good on narrower viewports, i.e. mobile devices. So the idea behind mobile-first design is that we set up a page to look good on a narrow viewport. Then we use media queries to style that page for wider viewports. We've actually done the opposite here. We've made the page look good by default at a wide viewport, and then we've added specific media queries to deal with narrower viewports. Now, there's nothing overly wrong with this. We can still end up with the same result, but the idea behind mobile-first design is we start off by styling it for a narrow viewport by default, and then for wider viewports, we introduce media queries. It's not necessarily right or wrong to do things this way. It's just a commonly accepted framework for thinking about these types of things. Either way, whichever way we approach this, the key idea is that our content is accessible and looks good no matter the size of our user screen. And in order to do that, we'll need to make changes to the layout of our content based on the size of the user's viewport, as we've seen in this lesson today. All right, thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next part of the course.